Hello and welcome. Part number 24 now, reading 2 Samuel 16 and 17 today. Where we left off, Absalom had returned to Jerusalem, although he wasn't facing his father at that point, but the scripture remarks that he was the most handsome around. He had gotten together an army, and he managed to take Jerusalem from David without even drawing a sword. However, the narratives are a little choppier in these two chapters, and this video will probably be one of the shorter ones. We see David still has friends. Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, had given David some supplies. And so part of this reminds us, David hasn't been all bad. His gesture to Mephibosheth was significant. One of the last things we read before his downward spiral began. And so it serves something as a reminder. Then as David is further traveling with his men, here is this character, Shimei, who is of the house of, he's a relative of Saul. David is now vulnerable and weak, excuse me, and traveling on his retreat away from Jerusalem. And here is this guy who's going to be screaming out all kinds of curses against David, gloating about David's misfortune, and even suggesting that this is how David handled Saul's household, and now this has come back to bite David, as we would say. However, we know, according to what we read in our narrative, how generous David was with Saul. And so perhaps this is something like the previous pericope there, where we were reminded of David's kindness to Mephibosheth. This kind of, by way of irony, reminds us of how kind David was to Saul. And so when David is seemingly at his weakest, yet we're reminded that he certainly wasn't all bad. But I think another reason why this occurrence may be here of this family member of Saul is as a reminder of the echoes that are happening as well. That it's the history that's kind of replaying itself again. A king has found himself a bit insecure, but there's also a contrast because Saul was illegitimately insecure, where David is obviously legitimately insecure. And this family member, he's calling out the curses to David. The advisors want David to kill him. This man is dishonoring David, and David asks, "What difference does it make? Things have really gone wrong. Why should I care what this man has to say?" It speaks to some of the history and pain that we've endured throughout this journey through 1st and 2nd Samuel, that this relative of Saul is still remembering what had happened in times past. So back to Absalom. There he gets to Jerusalem. Some of David's advisors decide to remain loyal to the infrastructure there, not to David, to the infrastructure. Their reasoning is God must have put Absalom in place, and it's even better that given that this is David's son. Well, naturally, Absalom is going to want a way to show and assert his authority, that he is in control and in power. And so they have some. They decide to advise and what way they might be able to give some public demonstration that there's a new man in charge, and Ahithophel is going to come up with a plan. He says, how about this? Take your father's concubines, some of his women, and sleep with them. In fact, sleep with them in front of everybody, publicly, so everybody's able to see that you are sleeping with your father's women. That's a dagger, right? They began to say that Ahithophel, he's some kind of prophet. His advice is wonderful. Yeah, go and do that. It's certainly going to shame David, and it is going to assert at this point that Absalom is the dominant one at this point. Like I said, the narratives here are getting kind of choppy, and now that we've seen Ahithophel introduced, he's going to give advice again. Why don't we? It's time. Why don't we go ahead and fight David? David is vulnerable. He's on the run. Let's go ahead and end this. Meanwhile, Hushai is another advisor that says, you want to think about this. David has turned into David again, in a sense. He's an underdog again. And while David, and you remember David as an underdog and what he's capable of. And so, we want to employ some trickery here in order to get David. However, that trickery doesn't work, and Ahithophel he ends up hanging himself because his advice did not work with regard to the attack, and because of honor shame, he's going to hang himself out of the shame, and that's a way for him to be able to die honorably, oddly enough. And so then, even at the end of chapter 17 here, David he has friends once more that are helping him. He's helped some people. They remember that, and therefore I think we're supposed to remember that as well. And so you'll recall a few chapters ago when Nathan was pronouncing his punishment on David. He said there's going to be similar things happen to you. You took a man's wife, made her your own. Well, somebody's going to take your women as well. Well, Absalom did. And, it also speaks to the characterization here of Absalom as well. We're not supposed to like him. Remember when between David and Saul, there was every indication that we're supposed to like David and not like Saul as this was building up. Well, some people might be wondering, who are we supposed to like? Who's the good guy? Well, if you thought David was now becoming another Saul and Absalom another David, well, hold your horses, because David still got friends, because we're remembering the good things he's done. And Absalom, well, he hasn't done anything particularly good at all yet. Not since, from the leading an insurrection, and since then, we have yet to see anything significant that he's done to attest to any virtue of his characterization. All right. With that, I'll see you at tomorrow's reading.